Being a video game critic can be very difficult. No, seriously, it is. Okay. Now that those who jump to conclusions based on my opening statement are gone, let me clarify that statement. Being a great and overall balanced critic is hard. Anyone and their mother can comment on the state of a piece of media, give their opinion on it, and lo and behold, that person is criticizing the work. Thus, they are in essence a critic. But obviously, critics come in all forms and qualities, and there's a ton of them out there to serve a variety of needs. Hell, criticism nowadays comes in many forms, so much so that the critics themselves can be criticized on their format or their art form of, well, criticism. I mean, just look at the state of YouTube reviewing. Going from reasonably joking yet serious under the surface in someone like Video Game Donkey, to a more critical and detailed analysis by someone like Joseph Anderson. Just like the art that they are critiquing, a single review can get a wide variety of reactions, depending on where the reader or viewer is coming from, and of course, there's going to be disagreements. What you would hope that would happen from that is a discussion on all sides that would begin about the criticism at its core, and talking about every aspect of it. Not just how to fix the flaw at the core, mind you. You first got to look at the core of a particular critique, and wonder if you're looking at it correctly. I understand that the critique itself is an opinion, but there is correct, and then there's more correct. Let me explain. Maybe a different angle or understanding of an artistic vision of the creator shifts your understanding of the item in question. Remember, just because you like it one way doesn't mean that everything that does it the other way is invalid. In fact, sometimes it's the exact right call based on a lot of factors. And that's where I think criticism can be extremely difficult to pull off, even for the best of critics. Especially when there's an inherent weakness in the implementation of a gameplay mechanic, but it's there to be used in conjunction with other mechanics to push the game to another level. In fact, it's the weakness of the mechanic that ends up becoming a strength. Sure, it's a weakness in a bubble, but we know that there's 100 bubbles that make up a bath. So, today, let's talk about criticism, in particular with a game called Forager. It's an exploration, crafting, and resource management game that's published by Humble Bundle, and it's had comparisons to a sort of mashup between Terraria, Minecraft, and Zelda. The game for me was a surprising one, mostly because crafting games like this usually aren't exactly my jam. But the addictive nature of attempting to get resources for the next build upgrade and expanding your little island was really fun for me, while not being overly complicated in the small details. But the game has gotten good reviews, but I admit there's something bothering me about them. Forager reviews, at least a lot of them from what I've seen, have this weird yeah but scenario. That the game was fun for them, and that it got a little bit more repetitive in the second half, but that things could have been a lot better if certain things were changed. Once again, bringing up the discussion of those weaknesses is a good thing, and critics need to do that. But what has been truly bothering me about those criticisms is that no one seems to be taking the next step in that criticism and wondering what would happen if you actually changed the mechanic in question. I'm not saying that the critic has to be a pseudo-developer and come up with an entirely new mechanic to replace it, but they do need to understand what would happen if you removed that mechanic in question and how that could affect the game beyond that mechanic, especially in the case for those who play differently from you.
Inventory limitations were another problem that was half solved with upgrades. Although I still question why a game like this has inventory limits at all, you can craft vaults for extra space, which strangely auto-stacks items if your personal inventory is full, and you can just use these items in the vaults when it comes to crafting. So they really are like inventory upgrades and expansions, but separate. You also can't pull items from the vaults when it comes to putting the museum bundles together, so you have to go and collect them manually, but you don't have to for crafting, which seems like maybe an oversight to me.
From Video Chums, the section reads, "Unfortunately, this brings me to my main issue with Forager. Once you unlock the market skill that allows you to sell your items, the pace changes completely. Prior to this point, you'll look for ways to make a dime so you can finally unlock the next island. But once you can sell all the gems you find, you'll be so rich that you can unlock almost every island with ease. Up until that point, I found the pacing to be just right, if not a little on the slow side. Therefore, the selling price for valuable items should be drastically reduced."
But other than the minor victory of upgrading your sword or something, it feels like a hollow acquisition. It's hard for me to really pinpoint why it feels this way, but I think it comes down to a lack of any real consequence of the few choices that Forager presents to you. The lack of consequence encompasses a few things here. It's very hard to die, for one, and even if you do, you lose a few minutes of progress tops. Inventory management is barely an issue in the early game and goes away completely once you unlock storage vaults. This is especially forgiving, seeing as there are no stack limits for anything in your inventory, letting you carry around enough stone to build Mount Rushmore brick by boring brick if you really wanted to.
As you can tell, there's a variety of complaints surrounding the game and some of its mechanics. And if you look at any one individually, there is merit to each of them. For example, on the surface, Joseph's point about how the vaults end up acting as more inventory space and that it doesn't seem to serve an overall purpose for the game, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. The complaint on how one can cheese the system with overvalued items on selling them again, seems reasonable on the surface. But as we know in many forms of media, there are multiple factors that need to be taken into account before saying, oh, just get rid of the inventory system. Because even if it solves the one problem as mentioned, it may have unintentional consequences on the rest of the game. So, let's dive into the core of Forager to understand my nitpicks of what was addressed against the game. The key mechanic, more than anything else in my mind, is built around the skill tree, which each level that you earn gives you another point to take one node on the tree itself, which starts as a simple 4-node tree at the beginning. And when you unlock one, it unlocks everything in the cardinal directions, or the ones that are not already unlocked. The game divides the tree into 4 categories: industry, economy, foraging, and magic. Each skill tree has particular strengths, such as foraging's ability to gather resources quickly, or magic's ability to be flexible with its potions and scrolls. But one must realize that certain trees have ways of doing the same things that others do, but maybe in a slightly different way. For example, if you need ways to recover energy, you could create food, but you could also do it with health potions. So those who go along those skill trees can get similar results, although they may be on a different level of effectiveness. So let's first address the inventory complaint put forth by Joseph Anderson. And how I'm going to address this is look at how the game plays without the vault. In the early game, you don't have a lot of inventory space, and one of the major items that you'll need to grab from the beginning is a backpack to allow you to carry a lot more and different material. I think you'll upgrade it 3 or 4 times throughout your journey. But even when you do, in that early game, you will have situations where you'll have to drop what you're already holding to grab a particular material you need to make another upgrade with. Now, if you're focused, you may not need to do this as much, but if you're like me and see a new upgrade and we're like, okay, how can I make this? You may be dropping things left and right. This actually ends up causing a bit of a wave, as you may have multiple of the same items scattered across the map, and you may not even realize that you have enough for a certain upgrade until you actually go and re-pick up those materials. In fact, you may actually avoid looking at the material instinctively in order to save that precious inventory space. So given what I've just said, it should be clear from the get-go that your character has certain mechanical weaknesses that are specific to particular playstyles, and that does carry over to other skills within the skill tree. Now, that is present in other games that have crafting and survival-like mechanics, but I will say that Forager is one of the only ones that not only uses it, it embraces it within its skill tree. And Hopfrog, the developer, has designed the game around those weaknesses in particular ways. Sure, games like Minecraft have mechanics where you need certain materials or higher level equipment to be able to get further in the game. But those games are so open in their movement, in their progression and choices, that you don't realize many of the mechanical weaknesses that exist. I mean, you're too busy exploring the world in those games, too busy figuring out the options that do exist, that you don't necessarily realize how limited you are to begin with. The thing that separates Forager from many of those games is that it uses the boundaries of its world, both in your abilities and the world itself, to expose those weaknesses to be one of the major focuses of the gameplay itself. It's almost like it's not about getting stronger in this case, or specifically going for a goal, but you're getting less weak. Yes, they are in essence the same thing, but how they present to a player and how they latch onto negatives versus positives are vastly, vastly different. One of the ways that you could see the purposeful design here is the map itself. I mean, let's think about this. Many of the islands that you unlock, while some have large structures and key certain points, could easily have been expanded in certain ways. And it's actually one of the big complaints I see about the game. The game is too cramped, and that there's not a lot of places to put down your stuff, or that nodes end up spawning being roadblocks in your ability to move around the map. In addition, this crampedness limits the person's creativity in creating their own little world, like you would see in something like Terraria and Minecraft. But here's the thing. You can't make the game your location and your own due to how restricted it is, and that's part of the point. I'd actually argue that yes, there is a way to make it your own because there are tools in the game that allow you to be more creative by literally creating land blocks or using bridges to create more spaces to place things. But beyond that, that's sort of missing the point of why things are cramped to begin with. It all has to do with that skill tree. If the game's natural spacing was increased, like I've seen some people say, then specific nodes in the tree would become less important, if not important at all. I mean, the ability to create those land blocks for one thing, that would absolutely not be needed if there were more space. Upgrades to your mining tools could be affected as well. Part of the reason why you may want to upgrade is the fact that it's much easier to move around the map. Your energy is important too if you have to deal with those resources that keep on spawning and getting in your way, so your upgrades to that and food and the ability to recover are important. Even the structures themselves, because they have size and the way that the things are constructed in this game, yeah, you have to find the locations to put them, and putting them in the wrong location can be a little bit of a problem getting around to certain areas of the map. See what I'm getting at here? By tugging on the string of the map construction itself, it ends up pulling on the strings of the rest of the game's mechanics. And if you were to significantly weaken that particular string, then those other strings would become weaker as well. It's very much like a spider's web. Take out certain key elements of the web, and lo and behold, the whole web is weaker to begin with. Where all this ends up really showing itself is in the leveling system. Again, the game's core is about getting rid of those weaknesses in my mind. So the more nodes you're able to grab early, the less weaknesses that you have at your core, and the more defined your optimal path for your playstyle becomes. But looking at the way your level curve works, the first 15 to 20 levels are pretty easy to get. The game allows you to figure out what's going on and look at the skill tree and define your character. After that, there's a reasonable bump for the next 10, but not anything that doesn't take time or feels like it's out of reach. And then the next 10 is a little bit similar to that. But the last 10 or so, the experience to get those levels are so high that the point where, like Joseph Anderson said in his review, you basically have to get those level up orbs in order to progress, or spend a long time getting the elements in terms of just going through the map, spending time over and over again, harnessing nodes, killing enemies, so on and so forth. Here's the idea. When you come across a particular weakness that's affecting you so much that you need to overcome it in some way, you end up looking at the skill tree to see if there's a certain ability that could help you or a specific upgrade. In the early game, that ends up not being such a problem. The fact is, there's pretty much a level around the corner, and you'll be able to get the help that you absolutely need. But as the game goes on, the level requirement becomes much more of a problem, and those weaknesses that you ignored become much more of a problem, like I just said. That museum that you want to fill up because you can't seem to find that one item that you can't craft yet? Well, guess what? You should have taken that earlier. The map filling up because you didn't bother to take that mining rod upgrade? Well, that's on you. It's why the game also feels at the end game to almost be a clicker or an idle game, because when you've gotten to the point where you've got no more weaknesses, the game essentially plays itself. What I think critics like Ingenious Clown Gaming are missing in their criticism is the fact that in the end, unless you're taking notes or really remembering every element of your journey, that can be hard to remember. You remember the ups, but you may not necessarily remember the slight downs. Sure, you remember the big downs, but you may not remember the slight downs that end up actually making a huge difference in your experience. Let's face it, when you've got a shiny pickaxe in your hand, you remember how you got that axe, and you remember the axe itself. But you may forget the coal, or the iron, or everything that it took to get that axe, and all the elements and the struggles that it took to get that axe along the way. Forager isn't about your endgame castle, your endgame inventory. It's about the journey, and every element along that journey, including how you moved along the skill tree, what weaknesses that you got rid of, and the decisions you made. Now, am I saying that Ingenious Clown Gaming's assumptions or Joseph Anderson's points were wrong? Not at all. The fact is, I started this video out with the idea that criticism is hard. And the fact is, their points were valid from their point of view. What I want to emphasize, however, is that for those critics out there, for those people who are looking at a game's design, to take a closer look in terms of other playstyles. Like I've always said with my criticism, I want to walk in someone else's shoes a couple of times before I make a final conclusion. The fact is, yeah, the game may not be for me, but it may be for someone else in my audience that may really enjoy it. And if you're a critic, your best thing is to try to find those people who match the game to them. At least that's in my mind. Part of the reason of why this video was created was to bring forward an idea that all of this comes down to a discussion between critics, their audience, and the developers who create the work in question. The fact is, yes, it can be very annoying when a person on the internet criticizes a work without understanding all the effort that goes into it. But you have to put that forward in order to get the discussion going. And yes, some people do it better than others. I myself feel that I do a better job of looking at the developer perspective because, well, I am a developer myself. Sure, I don't necessarily develop games, but I understand what can go into development and what costs, what benefits have for certain features, and how, well, certain laid plans may not always work. But the discussion is important to improve. And the fact is, even for critics, you gotta look at your own process, because at a certain point, you may be keying in on something a little bit too much or missing the whole point of the medium as a whole. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I hope this different video out of me in terms of game design is a little bit interesting in terms of people wanting to watch it and seeing more content like this on the channel. Yes, I am working on the Seabed review. Yes, I am working on other videos and that review format that I keep on hinting at. But until next time, this is Dragnix signing out, and as always, keep on gaming.